welcome to the HS2 Select Committee from all who've come from the far north and everyone else. Welcome, Mr. and Mrs. Pritchard. And we start off with Mr. and Mrs. Pritchard's petition today. Do you want to put up on the screen the map?
P6184. Mr. and Mrs. Pritchard live at Agden Lane Farm near Lymm. I hope it's coming up on the screen. That is. Slight pause.
Come up in a sec. On the assumption they get it up, if you'd like to kick off, Mr. Pritchard, if you can say your piece. Or...
Yeah, well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the from us from the north, and see you southern gentlemen. Or there are one or two northern MPs here.
Proper north.
Far north.
Proper north.
Yeah, Gateshead. Yeah, I know it well. Just to paint the picture for ourselves, my wife Margot, we've come down and from the north, and we represent our family who live in Agden Lane Farm. It's a family community there. I hope to explain to you, our circumstances, our feelings for the situation, how it's affected our lives, how it's affected our families' lives, and what we hope will come out in the future, but we don't know that yet. It's put us in a difficult situation, HS2. We understand the country's got to move on. I like to see progress, etc. But it has affected us quite a lot in our area, and particularly our house. We've got a house there, a farmhouse, which I bought off Margot's parents 15 years ago for market price, and we've invested a considerable amount of money and time and effort in it. At the front of it we have a cottage which we own again. I've renovated, built up. My brother-in-law's got 2 properties there, again, spent a considerable amount of money. In my brother-in-law's circumstances, it's part of his pension fund. For mine, I'm coming closer to retirement, hard though it is to believe, and for me, it will affect my situation in the future. So we have got to look at it in those circumstances. Presently, we are just outside in the spur, or the area where it's called the Tatton Spur, I believe. We're right on the edge. We're right on the edge of David Mowatt's area and George Osborne. One side of our road is George Osborne, the other side is David Mowat. The railway, or the proposed railway line, will pass close to our properties, 120 and 130 metres. And I think that's quite significant in the terms of the compensation situation. It goes right through our family field, and it affects every property we have. Access to our land is via a single track road, which you can get out at both ends. That will certainly stop, and in the future will stop. In addition to the railway track coming closer to our properties, the A56, which is the main road between Lymm and Altrincham, taking you onto the M56, will be moved closer to our house in the field in front of us. So we've been clobbered on every side in terms of that. Even though we are 130 metres away from the line as such, you will not be able to live in our house while there's work being done, in my opinion. It's too close. The value of the house now, it hasn't got a value. Or any of those houses and those properties haven't got a value. We don't want to leave the area. I mean, I've built this as our family home. It was Margot's family home before that. And it's something that you aspire to when you're a child. From the upbringing I had as a child, father's worked in factories, etc. I came from second house was a council house, and I've worked all my life very hard to enjoy, to get a decent house and a decent pension fund, etc. And we see the rug ripped away from under us. Where would we find another property? You wouldn't find another property like that. I know my wife's been very stressed about it, and the whole family have. where do we go from here? I don't really know at this situation. What we would like is, some sort of, we'd like it to stop, full stop. I think most people would say that when they came in here. But we are realists as well. In terms of compensation, we are on the edge of the limits for compensation. But again, you couldn't live in this house when there's no access to the land. And we're talking 10, 12, 15 years off. So our property could be blighted for 10, 15 years. Now, if you read the petitioners, our petition, I have a health situation that could rear its head at any time. I'm on borrowed time, but that's life. I'm not too worried about that in that sense. I'm more worried about my family going forward in the future. And I want to be in a situation where I know that they're being well looked after. We left home this morning, we had our grandchild there. I want to leave things to our grandchild, like you would naturally as well. Without this, with this hanging over our heads, it is very difficult to plan for the future. It's not a situation that we want or tried. I do believe in investment, in as I said before, and the Northern powerhouse, whatever you want to call it. I'm a very proud Northerner and a very proud English person. And in my opinion, if you gave £10 million to Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, Newcastle and Birmingham, would they build a railway line to London? I very much doubt it. They wouldn't be the way they were going to make money. They could use that money in far better ways, but that's another issue. So I feel as if, from our point of view, we've been blighted. We need some definitions. Already it's delayed. I think the Minister for Transport, prior to Mr McLaughlin, was Mr Burns, and he stated that it was going to be in October last year. We had an announcement last week, it's going to be October this year. Well, in October seems, or autumn should I say, autumn of this year, who knows? But we need some decisions in what's going to happen, so at least then we can start moving forward with our lives again and make sure that we can make provisions for the future. I feel free to ask me any questions, but there's other things we can say. But I've not brought any gear here. You'll see enough of the people, producing maps and engineers. Believe you me, we are blighted. It's a simple fact of life, and it's very difficult to think of. When you've worked all your life for those sort of things. Far away, ask any questions.
Okay. And it's a house, and there's a cottage, and what else is there?
We've got two barns. Two barn conversions. We've also have a Dutch barn, which quite ironically we've applied for planning permission for in the past, and it's been turned down recently. Whether that's to do with HS2 or not, I do not know.
Do you have a picture?
No, I don't. No.
We can envisage it.
You can visit. It's an old farmhouse, 1911. We've spent a lot of money on it.
And have you got a farm as well?
No. It was originally a farm, and the land was sold off, but we own two of the fields round the farm to protect ourselves from people who built on it. That was the reason we kept the land. So we protected ourselves from anyone who wants to build houses in the area. And then along comes a railway line.
You've got two. Your brother-in-law's got two.
Correct.
My mum has the
well, no, yeah. Mum has land, but it's all family land, yeah.
So you're affected by the proposal. You're affected by it's not there yet.
Correct.
You're affected by it's not all residential.
Correct.
You're affected. Full stop.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay. You've got the picture.
You've got the picture, yeah. It's just in terms of position. When I was doing the house stuff, I'll give you an idea. It's halfway between Lymm and Altrincham, if you know the area.
Yep.
And within the kind of you're 10 minutes from Altrincham tube station or metro station, should I say, into Manchester, and you're a 5-minute taxi ride to Lymm. So it's a pretty central position. We have no problem. I have people knocking on our door when I'm doing talk. Can I buy it? No problem at all getting to buy a flat place at all until now. The property's there. They would, and it wouldn't really. I don't know what it's valued at, but that's irrelevant really. But it wouldn't be a problem for people coming from Bowden and Hale down there just to come in and back, because they'd buy it tomorrow. The view of the back's spectacular.
Is it roughly halfway along Agden Lane between the Lymm Road and Warrington Lane?
Correct.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
It's got you on Google Earth.
You've got your Google Earth there. You can see it. You can see it on Google. We've got 3 dogs in the garden there. The three dogs.
One of them's barking as well.
Is it? Yeah. That's something while she's barking. Well, they'll all be there barking away. But it's halfway between that's the area. You'll see the white cottage at the front. And there's a Dutch barn on there.
It's very nice.
Do you want to add anything, Mrs. Pritchard, at all?
Pardon?
I was going to say, Mrs. Pritchard, do you want to add anything at all?
Not really,
Your
no.
family
Just Miles just said it all, really, and how we feel. It's just been horrendous since January 2013, and it's ongoing, and that's the thing. And as Miles said, we've got other worries besides this.
Yeah.
And it's just, we just need something sorted, really. We need to know which way we can go forward.
Yeah, we've heard from a number of people in phase 2, and the difficulty is that's time scale, which is sort of over the hill, and the rather more limited compensation scheme which you're dealing with.
And that's what I can't understand is the compensation scheme.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm a layman, and you hear. I've never thought about it before, but in terms of and again, quote, tell me if I'm wrong. In France, I believe there's a far more generous compensation scheme. They offer out maybe 50% of the value of the property.
Reality, but
it's certainly a balance above the value. You know better than I do. I don't know, but that's somewhere. But correct me if I'm wrong with that. But it seems to me that we've done nothing wrong. We've worked the northern terminology, tripe-off to get the position we are in, and we are still working. And it won't. You get in a situation whereby none of your own judgment on. By all means, the government realise, okay, we've got to build things, but compensate people properly and don't make it difficult, and help people in this situation. Where I think dealing with HS2, the only dealings I've had with them, well, they are poor. That's it, full stop. And we have anecdotal evidence of people, friends of ours down the road, who've had to deal with them, a couple of things, and stressed out of their head is not the terminology I would use, and they're not very good at dealing with it. That's why I don't particularly want to go through that scenario, and we're in there. So, but that is where the conversation, there should be, because we see, again, politically, we see plenty of money wasted on projects that we don't think they're any benefit, where people like us have had no problems, we seem to have to fight for everything.
Okay.
Could I ask, could you just increase the map size on the focus by, I would say, 20%, please? Thank you.
We have heard from some of your neighbours.
And that's 4 tracks wide as well.
Yeah.
Apparently.
And it'd be raised up because
raised.
it has to come over the Manchester Ship Canal, and you've got the M6, and it's coming out to be raised up there, and there's 4 lanes. And even in a HS2 report a couple of years ago, it said East Limb will have a noise problem on there. So, in effect, even though we're 130 metres from the line, it will be raised up, obviously, and also produce a lot of noise. But again, we're 15 years down the line, 12, 15 years down the line, these projects. I won't be here in 15 years' time, it's no things. But, it will affect everything we have. If we stay there, and we say we decide to stay there, and the railway line is there, our house value will go down considerably.
Can I ask Mr. Pritchard, roughly what's the distance between your property and the Warrington Lane? Because that's...
It's about, I'd say, it takes me about
2 minutes.
30 seconds to run down there.
Yeah, 2-minute walk.
About a minute walk, right?
Yeah, it's not far. And the train goes halfway between Warrington Lane and...
So I'm just trying to get the scale.
It goes halfway. Train goes halfway. That field, if you walk down from our house to Warrington Lane, you see a field on the left-hand side.
Yeah.
That's where it's going to go through.
Yeah.
And that's our field. And it goes through that field there. So it'll come about halfway through that field. There are some houses at the end on Warrington Lane. It just clips the end of one of those houses. It comes across the Bridgewater Canal. So it has to be raised all the time. And that's why, it's coming down from fairly height, coming over the Manchester Ship Canal as well.
Right.
It amazes me how they can afford to do all this. And there's no passengers are going to pass on that line.
Maybe we ought to hear from the promoters a bit and then ask 2 questions.
Yes, so thank you very much. What you've got on the screen, of course, relates to the Phase 2 consultation route. And as you'll appreciate, The position on phase 2 is that there hasn't been a final decision on phase 2. The Secretary of State, I think, announced a few days ago that a decision on the way forward for phase 2 is expected later this year. So I understand the points about the effects of delay on any decision making, but at the moment this route and what you're seeing on the map is the subject of consideration as a result of the consultation, and as you know, a number of people have made comments as part of that consultation on this route, on the details of it or what it's showing. So in short, it's premature at this stage to consider this as the route, but one awaits a decision later this year. On the particulars of what's shown here, this of course is a route which connects up with the West Coast Main Line to take HS2 compatible services onto the West Coast Main Line, as well as the siting a depot further up, which is called the Goulburn Depot, again the subject of consultation and consideration. So I understand the points made, but I have well in mind, as I'm sure the government does, the Select Committee's observations about this in the interim report, in which the Select Committee has expressed its view already that as to the desirability of an early decision following the general election. So I'm sure the government has that well in mind. Can I I know Mr. Pritchard has indicated he would like to stay in the area. If he changes his mind at any stage, there is of course the exceptional hardship scheme in operation for phase 2. I accept that's not of value to him if he wants to stay at the moment.
Can I ask Mr. Strawn, there's more than one house here.
Yes.
There's, would an exceptional hardship scheme purchase the lot, or would it only purchase Mr. Pritchard's home?
Well, I imagine that will depend upon what the occupants of those houses wanted to do. But in principle, it's open to anyone to apply under the scheme. There are various criteria to be met.
What are the criteria?
The criteria is set out in a guidance document which is specific to phase 2. I did indicate to Mr. Pritchard, and I'll just repeat that if there's any further information he wants, particularly whilst he's here, we have people who can talk to him. But I leave that up to him. But
the point of the other two properties are owned by my brother-in-law, and again, unfortunately, he's not a well person.
Okay.
And he would want to sell one of those properties without tomorrow, because he's in the situation he's in.
I didn't you finish?
No, I hadn't, but I was just going to... In the document, it sets out the various criteria to be met for the exceptional hardship scheme, one of which, of course, is owner-occupation, but so it's important that criterion is met for any particular applicant. But in principle, an owner-occupier of any one of those properties it could apply. Exceptional hardship, it's not an exhaustive list. Plainly, it's intended to cover the sorts of things Mr. Pritchard was talking about his own circumstances. So if, and I appreciate this isn't his current intention, but if he did want to move pending any decisions on phase 2, that there is that scheme. I have previously mentioned to the committee as to the balance that's struck, important balance that's struck, between, on the one hand, having some scheme there to deal with exceptional hardship, but on the other, not having a full compensation scheme in place before any decision is actually made. One of the criticisms that's often made is if you have a full scheme in place, it prejudices the way in which a decision might be made in light of consultation. So that there are balances to be struck. But if, of course, if a decision is made on phase 2, depending upon the detail and where the line passes, if the phase 1 approach is adopted, then their more detailed discretionary compensation schemes may come into place of the type on phase 1. That's a matter for the government in relation
One
to
of our properties is a rental property, which the plan was to sell the big property eventually and move into the smaller property. Now, would you compensate 2 properties in that circumstances?
Well, I don't know the details of your case, but, what I can indicate is there is the criteria of being owner-occupied. There is, under the the scheme itself, the guidance, there is the discretion, it's expressed in the scheme, to allow an application, even if all the criteria are not met in particular cases. So it's not for me to make decisions on the scheme. What I can offer, Mr. Pritchard, is the opportunity to talk to someone about the details of his case and to understand it a bit further.
I think if
What's the percentage of the HS?
I think in the report it was
30% for phase 1 and 45 phase 2.
45%.
30% phase 1, 45%.
Yeah, 45% is on phase 2.
Yeah.
I think it depends, Mr. Pritchard, whether you're treated as individual owner-occupiers or as a farm.
Yeah.
Because there are farms with more than one building, which tend to be...
It's not a working farm. I'd lie to you if it wasn't. It's not a working farm. But in terms of...
So, if Mr. Pritchard is thinking of applying, then of course he can make an application and see how it turns out. And there's no prejudice in making an application. You have then the ability to choose to take up the offer or not.
When can you reapply if you don't take it up?
There's no set limit on
There's
the
no rule.
application.
As we've heard it, is that you have the opportunity to apply now. If the Secretary of State decides he's going to move the line somewhere else and you're unblighted, problem solved. If he moves it a bit, say 100 yards or so, you might be in an even worse situation than you are now, but that's life. We've heard that... Sorry, can I ask a question? Do you know if the two properties are held on the same title or are they separate titles?
The two properties we have are separate titles.
Okay. Well, that probably takes you into discretion, possibility of discretion, rather than being taken together. I suspect if they're held on the same title, if they bought one, they'd buy the other. But if they're held on separate titles, I think you're into discretionary area. And I think that if you and your brother-in-law say, look, we're roughly in the same situation, and that we'd like to have discussions whether in the corridor or corridor and afterwards, what's the best way for you to explore the situation? The answer may be disappointing, and it may be that if it is disappointing, it's open to this committee to say, in circumstances where, put another way, suppose I was in a different house on the line, similar to yours, and it was a house that's twice the size, and that was going to become my pension. I was then going to sell that house and buy a cottage somewhere. That's equivalent to what you've done, except yours is in two properties rather than one. So it's open to us to consider, if we think it's right, saying to the Secretary of State or the promoters, in circumstances where someone has got their retirement home let out at the moment, next door to their present home, which they intend to downsize from, we can't expect the rules to cover every proper circumstance, which is why discretion is there, and we'd expect discretion to be exercised where appropriate, and I suspect that where appropriate should include situations like yours and your brother-in-law. That's not a guarantee it's going to happen. What you've done by coming here, and if I may say so, by putting your petition in a very clear way, and by your relatively brief presentation, has aired the issue. And it's then up to discussions outside, us to think about it, promoters perhaps to come back if they recognise that there is this potential problem. But I suspect it won't get a great deal of attention until we've heard from the Secretary of State.
Correct, and that's one of the problems. You know, we delayed and delayed. You know, you had, was it David Higgins reporting back in March on HS2+. And now, I know there was a general election in May, and I knew that, we've had our MP saying, oh, it's not going to go ahead. That was in April. Well, put that in writing to me, please, you know. Because I don't think many people, you know, for obvious reasons he said it's not going to go ahead, because we had a meeting in Lynn Village Hall which he attended, and he was all for HS2, everything for it, and suddenly he came up and said, I don't want the line in East Lynn. You know, because he actually battered in the God, yes, David Moe. He's been very helpful, you know, and I'm not so... No, but he suddenly realised, you know, from being very much HS2+, it was HS2+, okay, or HS2 fine, except for this, in it, I can't see any value in it. And it's surprising, there's a general election coming forward. So, again, we're in this quandary, this issue.
Well, I think you've done your presentation very well. There's not much more that can be said, at least until the Secretary of State comes to a conclusion on the more northern part of the line. And I shall certainly be left with the impression, I'm very very impressed that you can run 4 times as fast as your wife can walk.
No, she can run faster than me. She can run. And she has 3 dogs.
I've got 3 dogs at the time, yeah.
She can run down that road still. Is there any other questions you want? Feel free. If not, thank you for your time. And I apologise for my throat. I have various issues with it. But thanks a lot for your time. And hopefully, I won't be here again. The railway line will be moved.
Well, we'd like you just to be here again if you chose to.
And if, for my argument, I hope HS2 finishes. We have a northern line. We don't want a northern powerhouse.
Yeah.
I've got an idea. Move the House of Parliament to Manchester and watch it grow.
Yeah.
Or Newcastle even.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pritchard.
There have been some celebrations in your part in the world with Norwich being promoted. I was at the game. Were you?
Right, we now move to a presentation on ground settlement, which we've all been looking forward to.
Presentation on ground settlement.
Middlesbrough didn't play that well.
No, I was poor. Norwich deserved to win.
They had this getting promoted and then the season and they're going back up.
I mean, to be fair, on the day Norwich was about to say
As you announced yesterday, so we are moving ever closer to the metropolis, and as we do so, the railway line is going to pass into a tunnel, but not simply pass into a tunnel, but pass into a tunnel which obviously passes through areas where there are many buildings, and now, therefore, is the time to provide the committee with what I hope will be a useful overview of the topic of tunnelling-induced ground movements and their effects. Alongside me, to my right, is Professor Robert Mayer, who is the Sir Kirby Lang Professor of Civil Engineering and Head of Civil and Environmental Engineering in Cambridge University. And Professor Mayer is going to take you through a presentation just to outline the key considerations in relation to this topic. But before, if I may, just before he begins his presentation, I'll introduce him to you. So, Professor Mayer, you're Robert Mayer.
Yes.
And I've mentioned your current post within the University of Cambridge. Throughout your career, you've specialised principally in underground construction, providing advice on numerous projects worldwide involving soft ground tunnelling, retaining structures, deep excavations and foundations. Recent projects, international projects, have included railway tunnels in the cities of Amsterdam, Barcelona, Bologna, Florence and Rome, Singapore and Warsaw, and motorway tunnels in Turkey. In the United Kingdom, you've been closely involved with the design and construction of the Jubilee Line extension for London Underground and with the Channel Tunnel Rail Link, now HS1, and the Crossrail projects. You were responsible for the introduction of compensation grouting in the United Kingdom as a novel technique for controlling settlement of structures during tunnel construction. And I think the first instance you mentioned of that is in relation to the Waterloo Escalator Tunnel project.
Yes, that's correct.
You are a Fellow of the Institution of Civil Engineers, a Fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering, Senior Vice President from the years 2008 to 2011, and a Fellow of the Royal Society, and you were awarded a CBE in the 2010 New Year's Honours List.
Yes.
I hand over to you to present on this topic.
Welcome, Professor.
I'm so sorry, I should have said one thing. For the record, your slides are under the number R1246, and the page numbers that you will give as you go through are all listed under that reference. I do apologise, thank you.
Please continue.
Thank you. I'm going to go straight to slide number 2, which just outlines what it is I'm going to present. I'm going to start with some background and then describe the sources of ground movement, and then move on to settlement assessment, and then additional considerations for listed buildings, followed by mitigation measures, and then towards the end of the presentation discuss pile-tunnel interactions, and then something about utilities, and I'll draw some conclusions. So I'm now dealing with slide number 3. This is just to say that we're talking about, of course, the HS2 route, the tunnel section, mainly in the London area, and I'm going to describe the ground conditions and the groundwater conditions. So moving to slide 4, this of course is the scheme that is well known to you all, and what I'm going to be principally focusing on is the West Ruislip portal to the old Oak Common length. So moving to slide 5, this is a schematic of the ground conditions. I should say straight away that the vertical lines that you see on the slide here represent a large number of boreholes that already exist, and there are indeed a significant number of new boreholes that will be also undertaken as part of the project. To say that you can see where the West Ruislip portal on the left-hand side of the slide, and Old Oak Common on the towards the right of the slide. The tunnel alignment is shown as the black line, and I should so explain that the different soil types are shown in the shading, and I'll come back and describe those shortly. The important thing to say is that the Lambeth group is the first very significant type of soil that will be encountered by the tunnel at the West Ruislip portal, and the Lambeth group looks like the photograph here, and this is an exposure of the Lambeth soils which was seen during construction of HS1 at the Stratford Box. And the point of this slide really is to illustrate the Lambeth group are a mixture of, quite complicated mixture of clays and sands and gravels, to the extent that you can see a hole in the middle of the picture here, which actually was an instability of when that open excavation was made, the gravels and the sands ran out and caused that hole that you can see. This is simply to illustrate the Lambeth group are a rather heterogeneous and complicated mixture of soils. The London clay, which the tunnel then runs into for much towards as we approach Old Oak Common, the London clay, of course, as the name implies, is a very well-known soil type, something the Victorian engineers discovered was an ideal medium for tunnelling. It's a very strong, very stiff clay, and the photograph illustrates that. I'm talking now about slide number 7, and you can see this is an exposure of London clay, and that's just to get an idea of the scale here. This little thing on the right-hand side is a mobile phone, but it's a very strong and stiff clay, very competent for constructing tunnels in. I'm moving on now to slide 8, which shows the groundwater level, and this is important in as much as that outside London, a long way from the London area, as is very often the case, the groundwater level is relatively close to the ground surface. But then as you get more towards central London, as illustrated here in slide 8, the groundwater level in the deeper aquifer is much lower, and that's a consequence of industrial pumping for many hundreds of years, really ever since the Industrial Revolution. Moving on to slide 9, I'm now going to just say some things about the sources of ground movement and why settlement occurs. I will describe tunnelling methods briefly and then get into a little bit more detail about what we call volume loss and the patterns of settlement, and some information about the measured volume losses. There's been a tremendous experience of tunnelling in the United Kingdom, particularly in the London area. And I'll say something also about portals and shafts, and finally something about long-term settlement. So I'm now showing slide 10 as to why settlement occurs. And the first point to make is that HS2, of course, like all projects involving tunnels, requires excavation of ground, clearly, to form those tunnels and to form shafts and portals. And the ground around those excavations will require some kind of structural support. So in the case of tunnels, we need tunnel linings, and same with shafts, which are really vertical tunnels, and at portals we need walls to retain and support the soil. Now the important point that's relevant to this presentation is that the excavation and installation of those supports to the ground inevitably produces some ground movements, but they're small, generally small, and they're controlled. And those ground movements will cause settlement of the ground surface and will also cause some settlement of buildings and utilities. So moving on to tunnelling methods, this is slide 11. I think you will have heard from Mr. Timothy Smart earlier about earth pressure balance tunnelling machines. So I won't spend too much time on this, but this is just to refresh your memories. This is a cutaway view of what are known as EPBMs, earth pressure balance machines. And in essence, it involves a cutting wheel which cuts the soil, and the soil and the water goes through that wheel because it's in fact a series of spokes into a chamber here, and the excavation chamber is full of high pressure soil and water, which is then extracted by means of this screw, this Archimedean screw conveyor, which is like a corkscrew inside a steel cylinder. So high pressure soil and water then is taken up through the screw and comes down onto a conveyor belt. So this is...
Professor Mayor, I think everybody... Henry, were you on the visit to Crossrail?
I can't remember.
Well, we all went on a visit to Crossrail and actually were on one of these machines.
You've seen it? Good. So you'll know exactly what it looks like in the flesh, so to speak. So the essence of the machine really is that there is a pressure always being applied to the soil face that's being cut, and that's why it's called an earth pressure balance machine. And the extraction of the soil through the screw conveyor looks like this. This is a photograph actually showing the paste of clay extruding out of the screw conveyor, and that would have been the excavated soil at the face of the machine, mixed with various conditioning agents and so on. So that is a very brief summary of the earth pressure balance machine for the main tunnelling. But there is there is some significant sprayed concrete lining tunnels, SCL tunnels, around 300 metres between the crossover and the west and the portal. And this is a technology that has been used extensively on Crossrail. It was also used on the Jubilee Line extension for the stations. EPB tunnelling machines are used in Crossrail between the stations, but the stations themselves, involving some quite large tunnels, have used sprayed concrete lining. And this is what I'm now looking at is slide number 13.
They used that to come through.
Indeed it was. That's right. We've learnt a lot since that hiccup.
Did you call it a hiccup?
Yeah.
All right.
But it was certainly the technology and the experience of using sprayed concrete now is very well established. And this is a photograph on slide 13 of construction of one of the platform tunnels for Bond Street station of Crossrail. And you can see that the dimension of the completed tunnel is around 12 metres. It's very large. And when it's that size, it's normal practice to construct a pilot tunnel first. You can see that there is a 5-metre diameter pilot tunnel that's already been constructed. And what we're seeing here is the enlargement process from the pilot size to the full size. And you can see at the end of the rope of the arm here a nozzle spraying the concrete onto the recently excavated surface. And you probably saw that on your visit to Crossrail as well. And the essence of this is that there are very special accelerators that are added to the sprayed concrete as it emerges from that nozzle that make it go hard extremely fast. I mean, in a matter of minutes, and certainly reaching significant strength within an hour or two.
Out of interest, I've actually seen the same technique used to create a silo for wood chips at a power station. The only thing was the diameter of the silo was about 120 metres. So it's just literally going round and round and round. And they basically put it on the inside of an inflatable dome and then took the dome off afterwards. You know, it's really quite interesting.
It's impressive. Yes. The other thing to point out here is the monitoring targets, which one of them is circled in the photograph here, so that those are placed very, very quickly as soon as the sprayed concrete is achieved, and they are then through laser technology. There is a very careful recording going on of the movement of the tunnels, and the control of the whole process is very much part of the success of this technology. Just before I leave the slide, the man on the left down here he actually is holding in front of him the control. So he is actually controlling the spraying of that concrete from the end of this automated arm, all being controlled by a device that he's holding. The sprayed concrete itself also contains steel fibres, and this is the photograph here shows in someone's hand what they look like. They're typically about 25 millimetres, about an inch long, and they reinforce the sprayed concrete. So the sprayed concrete lining that is achieved is in fact full of steel fibres that give it significant tensile strength. The typical excavation sequences are illustrated in slide 14. So this is an example of just what we were looking at in the previous slide, of a large diameter tunnel with a pilot tunnel constructed first. And so the sequence would be to excavate the pilot tunnel first. That would be the first step. Excavate and line that with sprayed concrete. And then subsequently, in steps 2, that would be enlarged, first of all, in the top part, that's 2A, and then the bench, what we call the middle part, the bench 2B, and then finally the invert 2C.
What do you call the machine in 1? Is that? An excavating crane or an excavator? What do you call
that
it?
would be an excavator. That would be a hydraulic excavator with a big sort of rather. It can vary a little bit, but it would be typically a hydraulic backhoe that would be cutting and excavating the soil, followed up very rapidly by that spray concrete machine that we were looking at in the previous slide. So I'm now going to move on to ground movement, and the important point to appreciate is that any tunnel in reasonably soft soils, in fact anything other than rocks, any tunnel will cause some settlement. This is a highly exaggerated view here, but in principle, as the tunnel is being excavated, there will be at the ground surface ahead of the tunnel a wave of settlement that will be seen, and this is a half picture here, but after the tunnel has passed, there will be a settlement trough in a transverse direction, as shown here. So that was slide 15. I'm going to move on to and describe slides sort of 16 to 19, which illustrate this a bit more. So this is slide 16, which shows the longitudinal settlement developing ahead of the tunnel. So
is it possible to measure settlement? I mean, if you know what the soil is, prevailing soil, if you've got a cross-section of prevailing soil, and you're going through a particular area, within certain margins, can you predict? Yeah.
Indeed it is. Indeed it is, and I'll explain how we do that.
And it's always settlement that never surge, is it?
Very, very occasionally, particularly with the earth pressure balance machine, if it's very shallow, you're completely right. It is possible to cause heave. In other words, the ground can come up. That's usually because the pressure is rather too great on the face. But normally at settlement, but it is possible sometimes to have heave. Yes. So this simply illustrates what I was describing of the settlement occurring ahead of the tunnel, and then when the tunnel passes, there's a little bit more settlement and it finally stabilizes. The transverse settlement trough is what's left. This is, I'm now looking at slide 17, and this is obviously, I should stress, highly exaggerated scale, but what we see here is a settlement trough in a very well-known shape. It's always of this form. We have the maximum settlement, as you would expect, directly over the centre of the tunnel. It's important to point out a point of inflection here, which I will come to a little bit later on, which is really where the slope changes in the settlement trough, and there's significance of that as far as buildings are concerned. The very important parameter which I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, the volume loss, is a measure really of how much movement of the ground is taking place as a result of the tunnelling. And so we measure that by saying that the whole volume of ground in this area A, in the settlement trough, if we divide that by the theoretical whole volume of the tunnel, B, and express that as a percentage, that is known as the volume loss. And typically, for EPBMs, those are the earth pressure balance machines, the experience is that the volume loss is consistently less than 1%. So in other words, all of the settlement that's taking place in the settlement trough is 1% of the cross-sectional area of the tunnel itself. In an ideal world, with perfect tunnelling, if the technology was there, the volume loss would be zero. If we could actually get to that point, and it's interesting, over the last few decades, volume loss figures have come down consistently as the technology has improved all the time.
You're tunneling in such a way that the ground above doesn't know anything's going on.
Exactly. The holy grail would be precisely that, to be able to install a tunnel in such a way that the ground above doesn't know it's happening. But we're not quite at that point yet, so we still have some volume loss, but it's always less than 1%. Now, when we're doing sprayed concrete lining and tunnelling, that is, the volume loss is consistently less than 1.5%. And I'll show you some examples of that shortly. So moving to the slide number 18, this just is a schematic to illustrate the influence of the depth of a tunnel. So if you have a tunnel, on the right-hand side is the depth of the tunnel. On the left-hand side, the scale is settlement in millimetres. And if you have a tunnel, say, at a depth of 20 metres here, then the maximum settlement is, the settlement is shown by the pink, the red or pink line. But if the same tunnel is moved down to 30 metres, the effect of that is to reduce the amount of settlement at the ground surface. It's the same volume loss, but it's a wider trough. So the effect of going deeper is to reduce the magnitude of settlement experienced at the surface, but also, in fact, to affect a wider area, albeit by a smaller amount of settlement.
I think that's commonly referred to as the degree of differential settlement, isn't it?
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's right. And so in the case of the deeper tunnel, the differential settlement, which is much smaller than the shallower tunnel, where the differential settlement, in other words, the slopes, are greater.
And what's the variation that you can experience in that, depending on the geology between where the tunnel is and the surface? I mean, because you may have pretty robust starter of rock in between, where you would think that the amount of settlement would be minimal in most occasions.
Yes, the exact form of the settlement trough at the ground surface, in terms of its width, will depend to some extent on the geology between the tunnel and the ground surface. You're right. And the next slide, and this one is slide 19, illustrates the effect of tunnel size. So if a tunnel at the same depth of around 30 metres, if it's a bigger tunnel, a larger tunnel, there will be more settlement, which is to be expected. And the shape, the width of the settlement trough will be the same, but the magnitude of the settlement will increase as the size of the tunnel increases. And roughly speaking, because of the volume loss that I described just a minute ago, if you imagine doubling the diameter of the tunnel, you will have 4 times as much settlement. It's proportional to the square of the tunnel diameter, the settlement. So now, just to show you some experience of what actually has been measured in different soil strata, I'm going to move to slide 21. And this is what is illustrated here is the construction of part of the Channel Tunnel Rail Link, CTRL, now known as HS2. And what we're seeing here on the horizontal axis is a distance of around 7 kilometres, but on the vertical axis we're seeing the elevation in tens of metres. So there's a highly distorted scale here. We're seeing 7 kilometres on the horizontal scale, and we're seeing tens of metres on the vertical scale, and the alignment of the tunnel is shown in black. And you can see that it runs through, it was constructed from the Stratford box towards the west portal near St Pancras, and what you can see is it runs through a lot of different soil types shown in different colours. And I ought to point out that the Woolwich and Reading beds and the Upner formation are now known as the Lambeth group, and that's the group I described earlier, which the HS2 tunnels will be driven through. But the important point is that the tunnel was run from right to left, and there was a considerable amount of measurement of the settlements. And this next slide, and I'm now looking at slide 22, illustrates for exactly that distance, the same distance, the roughly 7 kilometres of tunnelling, the volume loss is plotted on the vertical axis. And these many different data points are shown on the right-hand side in the key as representing a whole number of different soil types. But the important message here is that the consistent, typical volume losses that we're seeing are always less than 1%, and in many cases considerably less than 1%. So we now have, from this CTRL experience, and indeed much more recently from Crossrail, we have a very big data bank of experience of measured volume losses for machine tunnelling.
What are the obvious reasons for the two outliers, if I can sort of call them that?
This one up here and this one here, they were the one which shows the outlier at 1.2% was they were at that point experimenting with a different mixture of conditioning agents and so on. It wasn't significant. It wasn't a problem, but they were doing that. So if I move to the next slide, which is number 23, this is a summary of some of the volume losses in SCL, sprayed concrete lining, in London clay. And there, I won't go through all the figures here, but suffice to say that there has been a lot of experience now on a number of projects, notably the Jubilee Line Extension project, but also the Heathrow Express, King's Cross, and of course much more recently, and actually only just finished, the Crossrail tunnels. All of the Crossrail stations, with the exception of Paddington and Canary Wharf, were all tunnelled stations using sprayed concrete linings. And these figures in the right-hand side of the table were the observed volume losses measured. And you can see that they are typically giving values of less than 1.5%.
Can we get the inlier, the Heathrow Express baggage transfer tunnel? Was that a very short one, or was that what was odd about that? It may be a volume thing. It's maybe a narrow tunnel.
It's not completely clear as to why that was so low. Actually, I have to say it's a smaller tunnel, and it may be something to do with that, and it may be something to do with the particular geology in that particular part of Heathrow. So I now come to slide 24, having spoken about tunnelling, also to say that there are portals and shafts, and these themselves will cause some settlement. And so if you have a wall retaining the soil, shown in the black line here, with props supporting it, there nevertheless will be some settlement adjacent to the deep excavation, and the extent of that settlement and the magnitude will depend on the depth of the excavation H, and it will also depend on the stiffness of the props and of the walls. But broadly speaking, the extent of the settlement is between about H and 2.5 H, going back from the edge of the excavation. And there's plenty of data to support that, plenty of experience to support that. The last thing I'd want to say in this immediate section on sources of settlement concerns long-term settlement, and I'm now looking at slide 25. These settlements that I've been describing in the previous slides are all immediate settlements. Those are the ones that occur during construction, as the tunnelling takes place, as the shaft is constructed. But in the long term, some further settlements can develop. And these occur as a result of slow drainage of water, particularly in clayey soils, from the clay into the new tunnel, because it's quite often the case that the linings are not 100% watertight. So there is a small amount, very small amount of water that percolates into the tunnel, and that can cause further settlements developing in the long term. However, they occur very slowly. They also result in much wider and flatter settlement troughs than the shape of troughs I was showing you just a few minutes ago. And the important point is that long-term settlements are not usually damaging to structures or to utilities.
I believe it's the case that London as a whole has been settling over the years by what, from a geologist's point of view, is an appreciable amount. Is that right?
It's correct. Yes, the onset of industrial pumping from the deep chalk aquifer in the London area, which has been going on for pretty much 200 years now, has caused the whole of the London area to settle around about 200 millimetres, about 8 inches, but absolutely uniformly. And so it has not been noticed in any way in terms of buildings being damaged or utilities being damaged, but there is very clear evidence from the survey data that London has been slowly settling.
So we were all in it together.
We're all in it together.
Since the over-abstraction stopped about 40, 50 years ago, have we been coming back up again?
There are signs of some coming back up again, absolutely. It's very unlikely, for rather complicated reasons, it will come back by the full amount. But yes, there are some signs of recovery. So I'm now going to move to slide 26 and go through the process of how we assess settlement. I'm talking about the settlement assessment process and how we define risk categories, and then the basis of the HS2 assessment process. And I'll give you some examples from Crossrail and from the Jubilee Line extension and draw some conclusions for HS2. So, slide 27, the assessment of the effects of settlement. The way this is done is that the assessment of the risk of damage to assets, and by assets I mean buildings or utilities, the way that's done is by means of a screening process. And so the process for HS2 is based on the same process that's been used successfully on Crossrail, Jubilee Line Extension, Channel Tunnel Rail Link, now HS1, and indeed on many other projects worldwide. The approach is quite intentionally conservative, and protective measures will be provided where the predicted effects using this assessment method are above acceptable limits. So, moving on to slide 27.
I think when the Jubilee line went underneath Parliament, there was some concern about Big Ben and the town.
Just we wait.
You may hear about that.
He hasn't given the most pretty picture of Mandela cases, but he's coming.
Okay.
It is going to be something I will describe.
But wasn't that grounded to stabilise it?
Indeed. If you bear with me, I'll explain that shortly. So, slide 28 shows how we do this settlement assessment in 3 distinct phases. And phase 1, we have very simple criteria based on settlement and slope to simply eliminate buildings that are subjected to minimal effects. And typically, if the predicted settlement is less than 10 millimetres, then those buildings are usually eliminated immediately under the phase 1 during the phase 1 stage. The phase 2 is for buildings which are potentially going to experience greater settlements, and what that does is to look at how the buildings might be affected by settlement based on what we call greenfield settlement. So we ignore any stiffness that the building itself may have. We simply make the very conservative and safe assumption that the building just follows exactly what the ground surface might do in the absence of a building. And phase 3 is a detailed assessment, if necessary, to determine the risk of damage and design of any protective measures if necessary. So we go through these progressive phases, 1, 2 and 3, in a very systematic way. And the experience has confirmed that the results of the phase 2 are always conservative. They're always on the safe side, and that's important. So I'm sorry, I can't accept that. Like, mixing up conservative and safety. Engineers have a different interpretation of the meaning of conservative. The slide 28 introduces some very important risk categories, and these are very well established.
By the way, we've also got the papers where one number ahead, so Q28 is just 29.
Thank you very much. I should have said 29. This is indeed slide 29. Sorry, yes. This is slide 29. And these risk categories have been very well established by our own building research establishment in the UK. And what this is all about is categorising the different levels of damage that can occur. So the descriptions of the typical damage you can see in the table, and essentially the way in which we can determine what is the likely level of damage is related to the tensile strain that we predict may be induced in the building. And this is important because masonry is very good in compression. The Romans knew that, the Greeks knew that, the Egyptians knew that. But what masonry does not like is going into tension. So if tensile strain is a measure of the potential for cracking, and the level of damage is related to the magnitude of the tensile strain. So these three...
Is there not a significant differential strain depending on the nature of the building? For instance, in the northeast of England, there are a lot of pre-First World War buildings which are built directly onto clay, whereas post the First World War, concrete foundations were being established at that stage. So there is obviously, from our perspective, we have an awful lot of mining subsidence, for instance, and there's a major differential between properties which are built directly onto the clay and which are built on a proper foundation.
That's absolutely correct. I mean, certainly it is, and it's something I'll enlarge upon in a minute or two. But differential settlement is the critical point. It's differential settlement that causes tensile strain, and good foundations limit the differential settlement, whereas poor foundations do not.
Okay.
The key thing here is that these three categories we're looking at in slide 29 are all of aesthetic significance only. In other words, although categories 1 and 2 are recording some kind of damage, known in the building research establishment classification as very slight and slight, all of that damage is very easily repairable. And the next slide, slide 30, indicates higher levels of damage categories 3 and 4 and 5, moderate and severe. And these damage categories are potentially will impact on the function of the building, or indeed may cause structural damage. And so it's an absolute principle in this whole assessment process that no building should be allowed to experience anything worse than damage category 2 in the previous slide. In other words, they shouldn't be allowed to experience damage risk category 3 or 4 or 5. And that's a fundamental principle of the whole process of protecting buildings from the effects of tunnelling. and deep excavations. So, moving to slide 31, this is the summary of the typical volume loss experience, which I've taken you through already for EPB machines and for sprayed concrete lining. You'll see, and the important point is the basis of the HS2 assessments is that the value of volume loss assumed for this settlement assessment process is 1% for earth pressure balance machines and 1.5% for sprayed concrete lining tunnels. In other words, pretty much at the top of the range of the likely movements that would take place. And in practice, the volume losses would be quite a lot less than those figures used for the assessments. So, I'm not quite sure why the slides here have these black parts shown. I think that's a mistake, probably in the transferring here. But what I'm trying to demonstrate here is the important distinction between sagging and hogging. The settlement trough immediately above a tunnel is essentially, if you imagine a brick wall shown in the top part of the slide here, and I'm looking here at slide 32, it goes into a sagging mode, which means that the tension in the brickwork is at the bottom of the structure. And you can imagine that if you imagine it bending downwards, sagging towards the tunnel. Conversely, if it's in hogging mode on the right-hand side, the tension of the building is in the top part of the structure. And that's very significant because the foundations of the building, in the case of sagging, tends to restrict and reduce the tendency for the tensile cracking and tensile strain at the bottom of the structure. Whereas in the case of hogging, there is no such restraint because by the foundations. So what this is really depicting is that buildings are more vulnerable to hogging movement than they are to sagging movement.
The words that are obscured by this, these black marks on the screen in front of us, on the left-hand side in relation to sagging is compression, and that then links back to what you said a moment ago, that buildings, I think you said, tend, all other things being equal, to perform rather better when they're in compression mode than where on the right-hand side where they're in the hogging, or to use the word that's obscured, extension mode.
Correct, that's exactly right. So this is compression at the top of the building in the case of sagging, but it's extension at the top of the building in the case of hogging. Thank you. So the next slide, this is slide 33, illustrates the significance of that point of inflection that I referred to earlier on, and that point of inflection distinguishes the sagging zone from the hogging zone. And it's important for the reasons that I've just been explaining that there are different calculations needed for the hogging zone than for the sagging zone, and the whole assessment process involves the calculation of the maximum tensile strain in the building, and that determines the damage risk category. The slide 34 gives you an example, a very recent example from Liverpool Street Station for Crossrail. And these, what we're looking at here are predicted settlement contours at the ground surface as a result of the station tunnels being constructed for Liverpool Street. And so you can see that potentially there's some quite large movements, up to about 75 millimetres of settlement. And the first thing to point out is that the phase one, which are eliminated at the very early phase, if you remember, anything less than 10 millimetres is eliminated at phase one. So those are the light grey shading. All of those buildings are eliminated at phase one. Then the phase 2 buildings are those shown in yellow, and all those buildings will be subjected to a phase 2 assessment. And then the phase 3 are the red ones, which proceed to phase 3. So the areas in red would all go right through to the last stage of the assessment process. It's also important to point out that in the case of Crossrail, that the running tunnels, which are constructed with the EPB machines, usually do not cause significant damage. So, and that of course is relevant to HS2. We have an example here on slide 35 from the Jubilee Line extension to illustrate for a particular building how we can do this assessment process. So this is Elizabeth House. This is a building some of you may know. It's the photograph is now shown on the screen. It's right alongside Waterloo Station. It's a 10-storey high reinforced concrete building, about 100 metres long. You can see the scale here. So it's roughly 100 metres long, and it's a 1960s, not a great bit of architecture, but a very common reinforced concrete frame building. And beneath that was going to be constructed some very significant tunnels, which you can see shown here. But what you can perhaps appreciate is that right under Elizabeth House there is a crossover tunnel. So you can, between the two tunnels there is a crossover tunnel, which means that there was a lot of tunnelling directly underneath Elizabeth House. And so there had to be this assessment process that I've been describing, and this is an example of how that happened. So plotted on the horizontal axis is that 100 metres long for the building, and that's in metres. But on the left hand, on the vertical axis, the settlement is in tens of millimetres. So it's a highly exaggerated scale. Tens of millimetres on the vertical scale, tens of metres on the horizontal scale. And the phase 2 assessment, which assumed a volume loss of 2%, gave the green prediction shown here. And then the phase 3 prediction was also done, and that showed the red line, and that both the phase 2 and the phase 3 predictions were done before any tunnelling and were published before any tunnelling took place. And the actual settlement observed is shown by the red or the pink squares, which is rather close to the phase 3 prediction, which is a much more accurate process.
Where it mattered.
Where it mattered, that's right. And you can see that where it mattered in the central part here, that the phase 2 process overestimated what actually happened, really by quite a significant amount. And what we were predicting was that around 40 millimetres of settlement would actually occur at the maximum, and we concluded that there would be no damage caused by that, and that was indeed the case, that no damage was observed in Elizabeth House due to the tunnelling when it was completed. And so this is to illustrate that the phase 2 assessment is intentionally conservative, and also that there is a very reliable process now that we can predict really rather well how buildings will perform. So to conclude what this all means for HS2 in the London area of tunnelling, we have a conservative and internationally accepted process to assess the risk of excavation-induced damage to buildings. And by excavation-induced damage, I mean tunnelling-induced or shafts or portal construction. And so what we also are finding is that for buildings that will be affected by the machine tunnelling, the potential damage category is always going to be in the region of negligible to slight, which is category 0 to category 2. But there will be some buildings close to where there are going to be some shallow sprayed concrete lining tunnels and close to shafts and portals where the potential damage category can be slight and occasionally moderate, i.e. moving into category 3.
Can you come to this? Is it additive? Like you have a shaft and a tunnel?
Yes, it's absolutely additive.
Could I ask Professor Mayer, has there been any mapping done in terms of where the intended tunnelling is to take place, in terms of looking for, say for instance, really quite old buildings which may have substandard foundations, for instance?
Certainly, in cases where the phase 2 assessment shows that the buildings are unlikely to be damaged, then that would not happen.
Right.
But if it's getting towards the higher end of the settlement and towards the necessity to do a phase 3 assessment, then yes, the foundations are certainly taken into account during the phase 3 assessment.
Okay, thank you.
And indeed there has been some mapping done in that respect.
Right.
Yes.
Thank you.
So what I'm now going to do is look at slide 38 and describe some of the additional considerations for listed buildings. So the first point to make is that all listed buildings within the 10mm contour are automatically subjected to a phase 3 assessment. Whatever the phase 2 assessment indicates, they automatically go through to the more detailed phase 3 assessment. Additional considerations that need to be taken into account for listed buildings allow for 3 things. Firstly, the structural condition, and that would include the foundation point that you raised. Secondly, the structural sensitivity, and thirdly, the sensitivity of heritage features. And I'll expand on that a little by the next slide, which is number 39. And that illustrates that there is an additional scoring system that takes into account the sensitivity of the structure and the sensitivity of particular features within the building. So I think this table is self-explanatory, but as an example, that if there were some very, very special finishes within the listed building, perhaps plaster friezes that were several hundred years old, which might be very sensitive to movement, then that would entail an additional scoring category of 2 in that case. So this is an additional means of taking account of special features for listed buildings.
This is a process that's been put into practice, for example, with regard to the Crossrail scheme as it passes beneath Soho, I think, Professor, isn't it?
That's correct. Certainly, it's actually quite a large number of areas, but in the Soho area, but also Bond Street, many listed buildings in the Bond Street area, and more recently on other projects, the Bank Station project, London Underground, are about to undertake to refurbish Bank Station, goes under the Mansion House and a lot of very important buildings. So this process is, certainly for Crossrail, has been used extensively for a large number of listed buildings.
Yes.
So I'm going to leave that slide by simply having explained that the increasing sort of vulnerability of listed buildings with special features is something that's taken into account in this assessment process.
Can I just say to my colleagues, this is the time to be especially awake.
This is the time you've already given a preview. Indeed, this is what I'm now going to talk about is what we can do about settlement if there's a problem. And I'm going to describe that in general terms, and then I'm going to give you a description of compensation grouting, and then I'm going to explain how that was used very successfully to protect Big Ben. So, in terms of, I'm on slide 41 now, in terms of mitigation measures, the first point to make is that we're always employing industry best practice during tunnel construction. And that will include comprehensive monitoring, so that buildings, the ground movements, the tunnel itself are monitored continuously during the construction process. So we always are keeping a very close eye on what settlements are occurring, what movements are occurring. And that, of course, is all about good control of the tunnelling machine and good control of the sprayed concrete lining construction. And what it's all about is minimising volume losses, keeping those volume losses to very low figures. But if those ground movements are still excessive, then there are other measures that can be employed. And that can include strengthening of the structure, it can include underpinning to improve the foundations. Sometimes it can involve jacking of the foundations. That is a technique that we have used. But in most cases, if there is a building to be protected, then compensation grouting is now the preferred technique. And the principle of compensation grouting is illustrated in slide 42. So if the tunnel is going to be constructed beneath a building, and it's predicted before the tunnelling that the settlement of the building is going to be rather severe, then what the compensation grouting principle involves is to typically sink a shaft alongside the building before any tunnelling takes place. And from that shaft, steel tubes are driven into the ground pretty much horizontally or possibly slightly inclined, as illustrated in this slide. And these are known as tubes à manchettes because they are a French invention, sleeved tube. And they are typically steel with holes in them, but each hole is covered by a tight rubber sleeve, very much like a cricket bat handle or by a hockey stick handle. And it means that what we're able to then do is that by monitoring the building very closely, and indeed the ground very closely, when the tunnel is constructed, during the construction of the tunnel, grout, which is liquid cement, can be injected from any one of those chosen holes. And it lifts off by pushing the grout under pressure. The sleeve tube, the sleeve lifts and the grout goes into the ground, and it compensates for the movements being caused by the tunnelling in such a way that the actual settlement caused to the building is much, much less than it would be if there had not been this process being applied. And the really key point here is that the compensation grouting can be used to control the differential movement of the building. So that's what causes damage. So the compensation grouting, you have the options of injecting from any one of a large number of holes, and those decisions are taken on a day-to-day basis to protect the building in a very effective way. This was, it may possibly be required for HS2 at a few locations, but it's unlikely to be used at many locations, but it may be used at a few. So I'm moving now to slide 45 to describe probably the biggest test of the effectiveness of compensation grouting that I believe has ever happened, and that was protecting Big Ben.
What day was that taken?
That was taken in about 1998. 1997, 1998, exactly.
This is when they kept the district line running, and they built the Jubilee line beneath, and they built Porthouse House above.
Correct, that's exactly right. And if you look in the photograph, you can actually make out, you might be able to make out that right across where I'm showing here is the district line suspended but still operating. And this involved, as you will know, an extreme...
It was actually passing without stopping, is what you're
yes.
saying? Yes.
There was a speed restriction, I think, but they were passing, nevertheless, through the tunnels continuously throughout this very deep excavation. This involved, as I'll show you in a subsequent slide, an extremely deep excavation. As you will know, when you use the station now, you have to go very, very deep down the escalators to get the Jubilee line extension. And just to complicate matters further, there were 2 new station tunnels being constructed right along Bridge Street between the station and Big Ben. So this is illustrated in the slide 46, where you have a cross-section through the station, which was nearly 40 metres deep in excavation. It involved putting walls down into the ground and then excavating between the walls, propping extremely carefully to minimise movements. But the important point is that the edge of the walls of the station was only 31 metres away from the foundations of Big Ben. And to complicate matters further, 2 large 10-metre diameter platform tunnels were constructed beneath Bridge Street. And so there was a real risk of Big Ben leaning in a northerly direction towards all of this new activity, which undoubtedly would have caused damage to the palace building, in particular in the area where the Big Ben junctions with the main palace building. So what was of paramount importance here was preventing tilt, and that parameter, the tilt, is best measured by thinking of the horizontal movement of the centre of the clock, delta. And the centre of the clock is exactly 55 metres above ground level. So in a subsequent slide, we'll be looking at how much that movement delta occurred during construction. So slide 47 illustrates on the right-hand side, the yellow circle is where the shaft was located in the middle of Bridge Street, just before going on to Westminster Bridge. And so in the daytime, that shaft was decked over with a steel decking so that traffic could use the road. At night time, half the road was closed, the decking was removed, and this is a picture on the left-hand side of a drilling rig being lowered into that shaft to drill horizontal holes and install those steel tubes right underneath the foundations of Big Ben. And the next slide, slide number 48, shows a plan view of that. There is that shaft in Bridge Street. Here is the foundation of Big Ben. You can see the scale here. So these tubes, these steel tubes, are typically up to about 50 or 60 metres long, drilled horizontally from the shaft in the ground below the foundations of Big Ben. These black circles that you will see, and you will see the figures 145, that means that for a typical grouting episode, 145 litres would have been injected, 145 litres of cement grout from that particular hole in that particular tube. It can be very well controlled. It's a bit complicated to explain, but in essence, the operatives in the shaft have calibrated long tubes which they push down inside the tube, and they measure exactly how long they are. They get to the point where the grout injection is required, and they then inflate packers on either side, which then isolates that particular hole, and then they inject the grout so it only comes out of that particular hole.
And then you take out the stuff afterwards.
And then you take out the stuff afterwards, and you flush it with water to ensure it's clean, and you move on. So the Big Ben itself had a lot of instrumentation on it, and so that the results of it was being monitored all the time, and the results were being beamed to the computers, and decisions were being taken every day as to what was necessary. Finally, this is the slide 49, which is the story of the whole performance of Big Ben, set over about 6 years. So on the horizontal scale, each of those is a year, and on the vertical scale, you will see this is the tilt of Big Ben, which is in fact that delta. So if you imagine the horizontal movement of the clock, that's what we're plotting on the vertical scale. So it was determined at the outset that up to 25 millimeters of movement would be perfectly acceptable without causing any damage or any harm to Big Ben or to the Palace of Westminster. And so for the first year or so, you can see slowly that delta increasing until that 25 millimeters was reached, at which point the grouting started. And so for the next 2 years or so, you can see all these grouting episodes, which are indicated by these little yellow dashes shown here. And the important point was to keep Big Ben in the control zone of not exceeding 25 millimeters. I should have said that the threshold was 15 millimeters at the beginning, not 25, 15 millimeters. But then to ensure that it did not exceed 25 millimeters during this whole process of construction. And you can see the progress of the deep excavation down at the bottom here, increasing in depth right up to 39 meters, getting to the bottom of the station. And up above you can see the progress of the tunnels as well. But the really important message in this slide is that during that 2-year process there was a very, very good control of keeping Big Ben pretty much between 15 millimeters and 25 millimeters throughout that construction process. At the end of the construction, the grouting was stopped, and we knew that there would be some time-dependent longer-term effects, and our computer predictions had anticipated that, and so after the next few years the tilt increased to nearly 40 millimeters. The important point to emphasize is that without compensation grouting, this tilt of Big Ben would not have been 40 millimeters, it would have been well in excess of 140 millimeters. And that would undoubtedly have caused damage to the palace and to Big Ben itself. And so this compensation grouting example I've shown you illustrates the extremely precise way in which we can control how a building behaves. And a tower like Big Ben was a very challenging example of how to do that.
It creates alarm. Tell us what's happened in the last 15 years.
Well, there's no alarm, I can assure you. There has been some very small amounts of increasing movement, but no more than the background movement that was already occurring. We have good evidence that Big Ben was very, very slowly moving northwards anyway, without any influence of the Jubilee Line extension station.
So how long before it gets the gates in?
What we do have is the facility for reusing the shaft. The shaft that's been formed can be redeveloped, and compensation grouting could, if necessary, be reintroduced. But we don't think that's likely.
Because presumably, at risk of momentary diversion, what happens with Big Ben and the rest of the palace is similar to the London Weekend Tower and the studios beside. I think they built the tower 2 upper feet higher, so it would gently over the years come down and come at a level.
I think one of the significant issues here is that the foundations of Big Ben are quite bravely constructed, to put it mildly.
Unconservatively.
So unconservatively. So what they did in the 1860s when they built Big Ben was they simply dug down, and remember, we're very close to the Thames, and they dug down as far as they could get before the water was simply pouring in. Stopped at that point and poured in what was really quite primitive mass concrete, and that was it. So the pressure under Big Ben's foundations is actually a very high pressure, and it's taking your point that alongside the Palace of Westminster on rather different foundations has meant there was a potential problem anyway. But we should perhaps just complete the story by saying that the design life of Westminster Station, I think, is as long as 400 years, isn't it? And so not only has the palace clock been stabilised, but also easy access on London transport to the house is reassured for many years to come. The last slide in this story I want to show you, slide 50, is the reaction of the press. At the time when we were embarking on this compensation grouting to protect Big Ben, the Evening Standard had a very dramatic article, this is in 1996, saying the tunnel may give Big Ben that Pisa tilt. And then when we had finished, the Daily Mail had a surprisingly good article saying that Leaning Tower of Big Ben is saved from an untimely fall. And it's unusual. Normally the journalists prefer to have the scare story rather than the good news story. But the contrast between the Evening Standard saying we're going to have a Leaning Tower of Pisa in central London and the Daily Mail saying it's all been saved. It's interesting to see that. So I want to finish with just describing some pile tunnel interactions. This is important because there are going to be some instances on HS2, as there have been on Crossrail, where the tunnels may go very close to pile foundations and might even intersect some pile foundations. We have good experience of this, and I'm just going to show those to you. So what I'm now looking at is slide 52. This is a very recent experience for Whitechapel Station for Crossrail, where there were some residential flats constructed in 1996 from load-bearing masonry. You can see that in the photograph. And this four-storey building was piled. The next slide, slide 53, shows a plan view of those flats on the left-hand side, and it shows where the two platform tunnels intersected or went beneath the buildings. And on the right-hand side, the bottom right-hand side, is a cross-section illustrating that these tunnels, which are nearly 11 metres in diameter, actually intersect some of the piles. So the piles actually had to be cut. And this was anticipated and predictions were made. The Phase 2 assessment, the Phase 3 assessment process I've described. And it turned out in the next slide, which is slide 54, that the settlement of the building as a result of the tunnel construction was nearly 40 millimetres, not dissimilar to the Elizabeth House example I showed earlier. And it also is the case that the settlement of the building was almost exactly the same as the greenfield surface settlements close to the building. The main message here is that the building settlements were tolerable. The intersection of the tunnels and the piles was not problematic, and we now have increasing experience of how to deal with that problem. The same station, Whitechapel Station, this is now slide 55, shows for Swanley School, which is also a pile building, a case where the pile was intersected in the tunnel, and you can see that in the photograph on the bottom left. There is a photograph of actually the pile from the school actually being intersected and cut, and again that was all done without any damage or any problems to the building, to the school. We have also lots of experience from HS1, from CTRL, where tunnelling has taken place, or did take place, very close beneath pile foundations for bridges. And this slide 56 shows an example of a bridge supported by piles driven into the terrace gravels. You see the terrace gravels shown here with the tunnels. These are EPB tunnels for which the volume loss was around 1%, and they were constructed very close beneath the pile foundations, but with very little problem. The piles settled by very much the same amount as the green field settlements at the level of the pile toes. And so this is an example of tunnelling beneath pile foundations with everything behaving as predicted. And the next slide, which is slide 57, shows a similar example of tunnelling beneath piles, but this time these piles were friction piles, which were bored piles constructed through quite complicated geology. Again, the tunnels very close beneath them, and the volume losses from the tunnelling were only about 0.3%, and again, very small settlements caused to the actual bridges. So the HS1 experience has equipped us with very good knowledge of how pile foundations behave when tunnels are constructed very close beneath them, and Crossrail's experience has enlarged upon that, and Crossrail has also shown us what happens when you cut piles as well. So, conclusions, and I am coming very much to the end now, on slide 58, is that on both HS1 and on Crossrail, new tunnels have been successfully constructed beneath and indeed through existing piles, and the settlement in all cases of the buildings and the bridges were acceptable. On slide 59, I covered very briefly the question of utilities. There are always a large number of utilities to think about: gas pipes, water pipes, electricity cables. And similar to the buildings, there is a well-established risk-based damage assessment process which will be adopted for those key utilities that will be potentially affected. And these utility assessments will be undertaken in full consultation with utility providers. And just as for buildings, mitigation and monitoring measures, if necessary, will be developed with those utility providers. So the final slide, slide number 60, I hope I've been able to illustrate to you that there is now considerable experience in the UK from Crossrail, from the Jubilee Line extension, from HS1, and indeed from the construction of many utility tunnels. There is considerable experience that very little building damage occurs. We have a conservative, internationally recognised methodology for the assessment of the risk of damage to buildings, and that is what is being used for HS2. There are proven and effective protective measures available, notably compensation grouting, which I've described to you, and these will ensure that the planned works for HS2 will be undertaken without significant settlement impacts. So I hope that that's given you the explanation of how settlements due to tunnelling will be handled, and how the HS2 project will use all of the very well established processes from previous projects.
Thank you very much, Professor. It's very interesting. Any questions? I think we've asked questions, we've gone along, but I feel more confident now.
I think the people who persuaded us that the open air, the natural graveyard above a hill, is not actually going to sink down into the tunnel, which is one of the worries that were put to us.
Vibration. When a tunnel actually has a railway running through it, there's a degree of vibration. Does that have an impact later? Or if a tunnel is properly constructed, no?
In terms of settlement, no, it doesn't have any effects. In terms, I mean, I know that Rupert Thornley-Taylor has already given evidence to you about vibrations through the ground that can be felt or otherwise, as the case may be. But in terms of those vibrations adding to or causing additional settlements, no, there's no evidence of that.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor. May I just say so that the slides which Professor Mayer has introduced this afternoon are on the HS2 website. So those who are interested in seeing these slides will be able to view them there. And I perhaps also should say that we obviously, the promoter will draw from upon the presentation you've had today and those slides as appropriate when we are responding to petitioners who bring before you issues of ground settlement during the course of your hearings.
Could I just add one more? There was a final slide that
Yes.
has some important references, and there's been a very important document prepared for HS2, impacts of tunnels, and there's the document C3 as well. So these are all provide additional information.
Yes, indeed. I'm grateful for you mentioning the information paper C3, ground settlement, which explains in a little more detail the mechanics of the settlement appraisal process that you outlined earlier, and also has with it a specimen of the deed, which, as that document explains, is available to those who qualify under the criteria that are set out in that information paper. Okay.
We are aware of putting a link to the Royal Society's video at the top of the presentation rather than the bottom, because I think it would be more comprehensible to most people than looking at the slides for the presentation that we've been privileged to have. So it might be worth just seeing people say, if you want to see something about tunnelling, watch this, and then if you want to look at the slides of the presentation that Professor Mayer kindly gave us.
Yeah, yes, indeed. Yes, we'll see whether we can achieve that. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor. We'll move on with confidence. Mr. Mulder, you're going to update us.
Yes. The committee is aware that the promoter has published a report responding to the committee's first special report of the session of the last Parliament. I don't propose, unless you would find it useful, to spend any time today going through the contents of the response. What I will say, though, is this, that the report is in a format which seeks to respond to the specific recommendations that the committee has made in its interim report, and that is the way it's laid out. We hope that is a helpful and clear way of laying out the report, and it seeks to cover, I think, the great majority, if not all, of the specific points that the committee made by way of recommendation towards the end of the last Parliament. I have no doubt that the report will provoke further thoughts from the committee, but also from petitioners as you proceed with your hearings. I should also say that the report indicates that on a number of matters that you raised in your special report, further work is underway, and it gives an indication as to when we expect to be able to report back on that work. I hope that's helpful not only to the committee but also to petitioners, because it gives them some idea as to when they might expect to see further information about the matters that are mentioned in this document. I think that's all I need to say at the moment, unless there's anything else that members of the committee would like to raise with me at this stage.
I think the committee clerk was said we'd have a more detailed response to some of our concerns when we had some new members as well, as we will in due course.
Yes.
Okay, we all happy? Right, that's it. We visit Aylesbury on Thursday, and I think we meet again on Monday. Order, order.
Committee Room 5, sound. 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 Committee Room 5, sound.